Hi everyone, my name is Karen Beck Pooley. I'm a school director with the Bethlehem Area School District. I'm also a founding member of BASD, that's the Bethlehem Area School District's Proud Parents organization. We're an advocacy group that's engaging and educating parents on the issues that are important to public education. We're also reaching out more broadly to our community, our students that are even in our schools, anyone interested in hearing what legislation is pending that has an impact on our schools. It's also a group that's just focusing some time too on bragging about all the great things our schools are doing, because that's another thing that doesn't often get enough attention in these conversations around school reform and school improvement. So that's me. I'm going to speak very briefly about issues of fair funding and why fair funding is such an important issue. We have, as a group, BASD Proud Parents, have been working for maybe the last 2 or 3 years on a range of issues, following mostly issues around charter reform, and I'll address that briefly, but have increasingly over the course of this summer turned to fair funding and become more involved on the fair funding issue, which got me to Pennsylvanians for Fair Funding, which is right up there on that first slide. If you haven't found them on Facebook, I strongly recommend it. Frequently have trainings like this one, but even ongoing conversations and email blasts about the kinds of things that are happening when it comes to fair funding, ways to get more involved. So that's what we're going to talk about, fair funding. Before we talk fair funding, though, we'll start from the beginning and talk about the degree to which Pennsylvania supports our public schools. Pennsylvania has among the smallest state shares of public education of any state across the country. We'll see exactly where it is that Pennsylvania ranks, but only about 1/3 of public education funding in Pennsylvania comes from the state. Typically, if you look at the average among all states in the nation, it's closer to half of public education dollars are coming from state government. In Pennsylvania, it's just 1/3 of our public education dollars come from the state government. And in fact, that gets Pennsylvania ranked 47th out of 50 states in terms of the degree to which it supports our public schools. What does this mean? Well, if the state is only providing, just so you can see, let me just move myself around here. If the state's only providing about 1/3 of the cost of public education, that cost has to come from somewhere else. Some of it is coming from the federal government, but by and large, it's coming from our local communities. And so what often is the case, if we have disparities between our local communities, those become disparities between our schools. We've got lots of schools out there. Bethlehem, to use it as an example, about 3/4 of our budget comes from our local revenue, our local real estate taxes. But the more you're relying on localities to support public schools, the more you're counting on the capacity of localities. And we've got over 2,500 different municipalities, 500 different school districts across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. They have very different levels of capacity and real estate value to draw on to fund those schools. And so the disparities between communities, like I said, become disparities between schools to such a degree that Pennsylvania actually ranks at the bottom. It has the biggest gap if you look at its poorest and its richest school districts in terms of how much funding students in those districts are getting. We've got about 33% less going to students in the poorest districts than those in the richest ones. And you can see that in the clip of the newspaper article. All right, so this is what we got so far. We had sort of a 2-part challenge. We have a really small state share of public education funding, among the lowest in the nation. And that means that our disparities between rich and poor schools are among the highest in the nation. That's where we are. One solution to this is that we increase the amount the state is providing to our public schools, and we think really hard about how it gets distributed between schools, recognizing that we have these significant disparities between our different districts. Low levels of state funding plus existing disparities between funding in different districts. And so let's think about solving both of those problems. We have a tool for doing this. And that is the Fair Funding Formula that was created a few years ago by the Basic Education Funding Commission. And what it did is it looked at those pieces of the puzzle that would either make it easier for local communities to cover the cost of education or require more to support students in those districts. So you can think of it, it's got sort of two different categories of factors that go into this equation that are going to figure out what portion of state funds an individual district needs to fairly fund its schools. So we got student-based factors. Those look at the overall enrollment, how many kids are in these districts, and then also the degree to which the district educates students who may require more resources. So what portion of the district is in poverty, what portion of the district are English language learners, all that affects the costs required to provide an adequate education. So we got student-based factors. We also have school district-based factors. Those look at transportation challenges. Is the school district really spread out? And so the cost of transporting kids to schools is going to be greater. In addition to how much local taxpayers are already paying and what capacity those local districts have to fund their schools to the level those schools need funding. So you combine the student-based factors with the school district factors, you roll that together in the formula, and the formula indicates what portion of state dollars an individual district should receive. Sounds good. The challenge is that this formula is only applied to a tiny fraction of overall funding in the Commonwealth, even though the Fair Funding Commission released its report, even though the report and recommendations became law. The fair funding formula, and I was describing sort of what goes into this fair funding formula so we can figure out which monies needs to go to which districts, only the increases in education funding, the new money that goes to our schools, runs through this fair funding formula. And as of current years, it's really only about 1 out of every $10 that goes towards our school is allocated fairly. The other 9 are allocated, and we'll talk about this in the way they've sort of always been allocated. We'll talk through this. Why only the new money? So only 1 out of $10 is going to districts according to the way in which the fair funding formula would suggest. And this largely stems from Pennsylvania's practice of hold harmless. This hold harmless approach dates back to the 1990s. And what it does is it sort of, through momentum, has effectively become the way in which we fund our schools, but try to ensure that any given year, a district doesn't receive any less than it received the year before. So we may expand money. We're going to make sure that no district gets less from the state than they did the prior year. Makes sense maybe initially as you think about it, but one thing that quickly causes some problem is that if everything about all our districts stayed the same, then hold harmless would make sense, that what districts needed last year, what they were capable of providing themselves or not capable of providing themselves, stayed the same. Then hold harmless makes sense and it doesn't cause any particular damage. Challenge is, if you think about it, over the last 30 years, the period of time that we've been practicing this hold harmless, where we basically funded based on what we funded last year, that adds up. So we're 30 years in now. 30-year-old enrollment data is still determining where we send our state dollars for schools, and how our communities look, which have grown, which have shrunk over those last 30 years, suddenly makes this existing allocation, where 9 out of 10 of our dollars go, not make a lot of sense. So you can see how our funding becomes pretty unfairly allocated. And so, think about those 30 years. On the whole, we have about the same students enrolled in our public schools now as we did 30 years ago. So on the whole, that hasn't changed much. But if you drill down below the state level to our district levels, you've seen pretty dramatic changes. In the Basic Education Funding Commission, the commission charged with coming up with this formula, even noted this back a couple of years ago, that roughly 2/3 of districts had gotten smaller, so now had fewer students to educate, and 1/3 had grown, now had more students to educate. And so the fact that we're still allocating dollars based on old enrollments meant that 2/3 of our districts were getting money for students they no longer had, and 1/3 of our districts weren't getting enough money to accommodate the rising number of students they now had. So it makes for some pretty bad outcomes to otherwise keeping funding the same. In fact, we've got over $1 billion of public education fundings that is misallocated. In other words, our growing districts, if you were to run all of the money, all 10 out of $10 through the fair funding formula, those districts would get over $1 billion more, nearly $1.2 billion more. Currently, that $1.2 billion goes to districts that, according to the fair funding formula, are getting more than their share based on smaller class sizes. Not smaller class sizes, smaller enrollments. But if you think about it, we've got a significant number of districts now that are getting $1 billion less, $1.2 billion less than they should. We've been talking about hold harmless because we don't want anyone getting less money than they did the year before. But what we haven't talked about is what this means for those growing districts that have really been held harmed significantly over this last stretch of time, consistently getting less than their fair share of state funds. Who does this hurt? Let's talk about this specifically because, we're thinking about enrollment trends and who's grown and who's shrunk. But if we run the fair funding formula, underfunded districts, those, if you compare what they currently get in state funding versus what the fair funding formula suggests they should get from the fair funding formula, it hurts over half of our students. 51% of students in Pennsylvania are in districts that are underfunded right now, based on our practice of only providing a small share of dollars through the fair funding formula. This also hurts nearly all, roughly 80%, 4 out of 5 minority students, Black students and Hispanic students across the Commonwealth. Vast majority of Black and Hispanic students are in districts that receive less than their fair share in state funding. And just to really stress this point, over half of both Black and Hispanic students in Pennsylvania are in districts that are underfunded by at least $10 million each year, so receive significantly less than they should. This isn't just a student story. If you think about it, where we started this whole discussion was the idea that if the state is paying less, then localities are paying more. Taxpayers in these growing districts are also held harm. If you look at the most overfunded and the most underfunded districts, those taxpayers are paying 1.5 times as much as taxpayers in the most overfunded ones. And so just as an example, on a $185,000 house, it's roughly the average value statewide. Homeowners are paying about $3,000 in real estate taxes in the most overfunded districts, but they're paying nearly $5,000 in the most underfunded ones. Significant difference. So not just harming students who aren't receiving their fair share of education funding, but also harming taxpayers who are bearing 1.5 times the burden of paying for public education in underfunded districts compared to overfunded ones. It's worth noting we saw the disparate impacts on white versus minority students, who's more likely to be in districts that are underfunded and significantly underfunded. Same holds for our taxpayers. Minority taxpayers, minority households, make up 1/3 of all households in districts that are underfunded, just 7% of those in districts that are overfunded. So this practice that we have, we recognize we've figured out how to fairly fund our schools, but we only fairly fund our schools with 1 out of every $10 we spend on public education. Specifically hurts minority students. It specifically hurts minority households and taxpayers too. But it hurts over half of our students who attend underfunded districts and a significant portion of our taxpayers who live in districts which have grown but are not receiving state support. So it's just worth taking a minute to think about this idea of hold harmless, which sounds kind of benign, but in fact is hiding the fact that by holding harmless, we're actually choosing to hold harmed, hurting students of taxpayers, and particularly students of taxpayers and taxpayers of color. And I should note too, it's worth just contemplating that the Basic Education Funding Commission looked at this issue of holding harmless, looked at the fact that more districts had lost students than gained students, and so would likely see some state level of funding decline if we switched entirely to the fair funding formula. At no point did the commission really dig into the degree to which those districts would be harmed, or the degree to which they could shift from state support to local support, or the degree to which the state could ease that transition through other measures, is one thing that the commission didn't spend a lot of time or any time really contemplating. The commission also didn't spend any time seriously considering what holding harmless or holding harmed would mean for those consistently underfunded districts. And so it's worth noting that that commission never fully took that into consideration either. And that it's not like we haven't implemented policy and changes that have reduced funds made available to districts. It's not that we've flat out refused to reduce our support for different schools. Charter reform is a great example. We at one point reimbursed districts for the tuition they paid to charter schools. At a certain point, it was decided that that would no longer be the case. That has cost districts a significant amount of state support. If we had held harmless, we would not have passed that type of action. But you know, we're holding harmless in some respects, and we're not holding harmless in others. We'll focus again on who's sort of at the losing end of most of these decisions. So what do we do? What do we do? We've got big disparities between different districts. These disparities hurt our students of color and our taxpayers of color most. What do we do about it? What we've been having significant conversations about, and what I encourage you to get involved in, are more conversations around how to get all state funding, 10 out of $10, running through that fair funding formula. There are bills currently in both House and Senate committees that are designed to do this. Some of them would do it immediately, sort of in year one, we'd switch entirely. Others would sort of ramp the shift up over the course of 4 years. But there are multiple ways in which that change from 1 out of $10 to 10 out of $10 being allocated fairly could occur. The other thing we could do is think about fair funding as part of a comprehensive package of other ways in which we need to adjust the way in which we support public schools. Charter reform is a big one that's out there. I've mentioned it a couple times, but it's worth noting that 75% of all charter tuition in the Commonwealth is paid by school districts who are underfunded. And those amounts are almost identical, 1.2 billion underfunded because we're not using the fair funding formula, 1.2 billion in charter tuition going out of those districts. But there's also a need to look at the way in which we support special education, the way in which we support student transportation, and all of these things taken together could allocate overall support, state support for public schools far more fairly, could neutralize the impact of the shift to fair funding on districts who might see basic education funding decline, but might face, you know, challenges as they relate to transportation, charters, or special education. There's no reason any one of these has to be done without the others. Please, like I said, find Pennsylvanians for Fair Funding on Facebook. I hope this has been helpful and look forward to having conversations with all of you about this work going forward. Thanks.